Hello. We're going to get started. So first off, thank you all for coming. I appreciate you all coming out for this. So yeah, this month's talk, and if you weren't aware, we do have these once a month, generally the first Thursday of the month, but next month it won't be the first Thursday because that's July 4th. And as exciting as my talks are, I think people are going to rather do fireworks and hamburgers than listen to me. So anyway, but we are doing one. We'll talk about when it actually is next month at the end. But first, let's get to the program. So my name is Daniel Neff, if you don't know me already. I'm the curator at the Fairbanks House right here in Dedham. Excuse me. And my wife Allison and I do quite a lot of research for the museum, and in so doing, we found a lot of stuff that people kind of assume or have heard from other places, or just the whole grapevine issue of sometimes the things we hear as facts, well, just aren't. And we end up with myths and misconceptions. And today we're talking about one specifically relating to the Fairbanks family, the Fairbanks House, and colonial New England in general. So we'll start with the family. And right all the way to the beginning, how the house is built. So first off, we have the myth. And so the Fairbanks family myths we're talking about today mostly are ones that come from older research on the family, some family legends, families have stories about their ancestors, and sometimes they get a little embellished. So that's what we're going to start here. So Jonathan Fairbanks and his 4 sons built the house themselves, with their bare hands. And you even hear sometimes that they built the house out in the wilderness, or that Jonathan was the founder of the town of Dedham. Not quite on any of that. So they may have helped, but they weren't the guys in charge. The way the house is built, somebody of Jonathan's skill set would have been a help in building it. He was a woodworker, but he was by no means a house builder. He would not have known how to build a house that would last as long as the one that we still have today. The house was built by one of 2 guys. We've narrowed it down, either John Roper or John Kingsbury. They're the guys who were in charge. They were the architect, the designer, and the man in charge. So Fairbanks and his sons may have helped, but they weren't the ones who built the house themselves. Also, they weren't even among the founders, let alone the founder of Dedham. It's founded by 30 families. They get a charter from the Massachusetts Colonial Bay government in 1635. Get there in 1636, and then the Fairbanks get there in 1637. So they are close, though. And it's only half a day, or even back then by a horse-drawn carriage, it's only about a half a day's ride from Boston. So we're not, even back then, this is not out in the middle of nowhere. It's sort of the outskirts, but it's not the wilderness by any stretch. So there are roughly 30 families found in the town of Dedham. Fairbanks are not one of those families. They are, however, the first family admitted to the town after it's founded. So they're close. They're almost founders. Missed it by that much. But, so anyway, some other legends that you hear particularly in family stories is that the house is built out of the ship they came over on. They brought they took the ship over from England, and then they built the house out of it. Or that the bricks in the chimney are made out of the ballast from that same ship. There's a problem with both. Well, there's a lot of problems with both of these. First off, if they owned a ship, they wouldn't have needed to move to New England. They would have had a perfectly lucrative career back in England. But also the number of bricks in that chimney, if those of you who visited the Fairbanks house have seen the massive chimney with roughly 40,000 bricks. That many bricks would sink your average 1600 ship if you try to use them as ballast. So, in fact, actually much more impressive than any of that, all of the materials used to build the Fairbanks house were locally sourced. They're from the greater Dedham area. Even in 1637, all of it's from right here, with one exception, the glass in the windows. That's the only thing they don't know how to make in the greater Boston area by 1637. Everything else in the house, made right here. So, I think that's actually more interesting than the old family legend about it. And the Fairbanks house is by no means the only place that has this legend attached to it. Almost every house in Plymouth at one point or another was built out of the Mayflower. Similarly, the Pilgrims didn't even own the Mayflower. In fact, the only trip that ship ever made to this continent was to bring the Pilgrims over. As soon as it was clear they weren't going to die immediately, they went back to England and stayed there. So there is some truth to it, though, actually. This is kind of a tangent, but it's fun. The Mayflower is eventually turned into a barn in England. So this whole idea of building a house out of your boat isn't completely out of left field, but it's pretty close to left field. But it's not all the way there. Oh yeah, this is just a diagram of the house. You can see how complex the construction of the Fairbanks house was. As good as a woodworker as Jonathan was, he would not have known how to do this. He's a wood turner. He built things using lathe. His stuff is great, but it doesn't look like this. Some more house myths. The entire house, everything we see today, has been there since 1636. And then, and also that everything that's in the house has been there since 1636 and it belonged to Jonathan and Grace, the original owners. So these are both things I've heard, or both things that people kind of assume without asking. But there is problems with both of these. First off, the house isn't even built in 1636. We now know it was built 1637, so at least we're close on that one. And parts of it weren't made until as late as the early 1800s. It's actually built up over many, many years. Whoops, getting ahead of myself. So the part in green is the original part of the house. That's what was built in 1637. Blue was built around 1650, 16 or so, give or take 10 years. 1650 about. Red is built in the 1690s. Somewhere around 1790, 1800, they built the orange part, and then these three little purple add-ons were all added 1800, 1810, thereabouts. So, yeah, so the house is not all built in one go. I've also heard so Jonathan is the founder of the family. His oldest son was John. So they used to call this, the tour guides and the curator and everybody before they did more research, would even call this section John, his oldest son's parlor. So this was made for his son. Now it's made 200 years later for his great-great-great-great-grandson. So yeah, and that actually happens with a lot of historic houses. People see a historic location and they kind of put it in their mind as a specific time. So we saw this house here, okay, it was built in 1638, so the whole house is 1638, or 1637 or whatever. But that's particularly a place like the Fairbanks, that's not true. 8 generations of that family lived there over 267 years. So it's not just one generation and it's a museum, it's 8 generations of people actively living in it, modifying it, changing it, doing whatever you do with your own house, because it was theirs. So that's something to keep in mind when you're at any historic site. And yeah, like I said, 8 generations lived there and bought stuff and used stuff and broke stuff. And so some of the stuff does date all the way back to 1637, but most of it is from later generations. Another really popular family myth that I hear on a very regular basis is that there's an escape tunnel under the house. Very dramatic, that there's this tunnel that they dug so that if Native Americans attacked, the tunnel went out into the nearby swamp and they could run away. If there's a secret tunnel, then it must have also been part of the Underground Railroad. Because every house ever, no matter how inappropriate that is, if it's got a secret room or secret tunnel or something, it must have been in the Underground Railroad. It's just sort of a logical jump that is easy to make, but it is a jump. First off, no evidence that there was a tunnel under the house. And in fact, if they had tried to dig one, the water table in that area is so high, that tunnel would be underwater 3/4 of the year. So even if they had made a tunnel, it would have been a really useless one. There's also, as I said, Dedham's pretty close to Boston. Though there was always the concern that there was Native American or French or whoever attacking, the odds were low, and they knew that. And so they're not going to go crazy and build tunnels and stuff. They're just not that worried about it. Now, the Underground Railroad, for the most part, does not even go through Massachusetts. As much as people want to tell you that every historic house with a back room was on the railroad, for the most part, the Underground Railroad goes through upstate New York, Ohio, and Indiana. It didn't really go into New England that much because it's a detour. If you look at the southern states. You want to just go straight north. That takes you through New York. It doesn't take you through New England. So sadly, not too much connection with that. What else we got? Oh yeah, so on to the fun part, family feuds, right? Every family's got that one cousin or whatever that they don't like. And of course the Fairbanks have maybe a few. But anyway, this is, and there's to the point where there's even differences in spelling. There's today we have Fairbank and Fairbanks, with or without an S. And this is all over, and it seems spread out throughout the country. So I'm sure many of you know the Fairbanks family is rather large at this point. Somewhere in the tens of thousands of people in the family. And all Fairbanks in the U.S. are the same Fairbanks. They're all descended from Jonathan and Grace. So why would they all spell their name different ways if they're all the same Fairbanks? Well, we got this legend came out of this, and it sounds pretty reasonable when you first hear it, that there was some sort of family feud, and we didn't all want to have our names spelled the same way. So some people, one side, you know, it's sort of a Hatfields McCoys kind of thing. Like one side kept the S, one side didn't, and everybody's mad at each other. There's also, the other family feud story involves the three sisters that lived in the house in the 1800s. So you have three unmarried sisters living in the old house, Prudence, Sally, and Nancy Fairbanks. And so it's three old unmarried ladies, and so people of course assume that they must have been, you know, they never got married, they're not out and about being social, so they must be rude and cantankerous, and they must have hated each other. And oh, look at the evidence, we have three sections of the house, each with their own staircase. So they must have divided the house into three parts and interacted as little as possible. Yeah, but no. First off, the three sisters were socialites. People in Dedham loved them. They were really active. And actually all evidence suggests part of why they were spinsters, there was financial issues in the family that would have prevented them from getting a dowry. But a lot of evidence suggests those three weren't too shook up about the fact they never got married. They were okay with it from everything we've seen. And they were definitely very popular, they were very socialite, they were very gregarious, friendly. And they all, particularly Sally and Nancy, the two younger of those three sisters, were rarely seen apart. They spent all of their time together. Well, it turns out it's just an artifact of the way the house was built. So again, you have this part's built, then this part, then this part. Well, they each have their own separate staircases because they're each built practically as separate buildings that happen to be next to each other. Actually, this part was originally built elsewhere and then moved over. So each section is going to have its own staircase with its own upstairs because each was built separately. But people see that and assume that there's some sort of family animosity that leads to them dividing the house. That's just the way the house is built. Now, as for the name, so we have Fairbank and Fairbanks, but the problem with assuming that has any real meaning is the dictionary, or the lack thereof, until 1828. Noah Webster publishes his first full edition of his dictionary in 1828, and this is often considered by many people to be where English becomes standardized. Before that, there isn't actually a specific way to spell things. Most people just spelled phonetically. This gets really funny when you're reading something written by somebody with a heavy accent. The best example of this is Paul Revere, who was, actually I could give a whole talk just about things that are myths about Paul Revere. Pretty much everything you know about him, the opposite is true. But one of the things about Paul Revere was he was raised lower class and kind of worked his way up. But that meant he didn't just have a Boston accent, he had a really heavy one. And so when he was writing, he would actually drop his R's, add A's. So he actually wrote with a Boston accent. It's kind of amazing. So if you can ever find something written by Paul Revere, I suggest trying to look it up and see if you can find that. Yeah, so if you have Paul Revere writing with a Boston accent, the difference between Fairbank and Fairbanks starts to seem a little less coherent, a little less prominent, right? Well, it turns out so this is for standard, normal word spelling, 1828. Well, it turns out names take even longer to standardize. So I managed to compile a few different ways the name was spelled. This is just ways members of the family spelled it. If I added ways clerks and office people and all those sorts and named it, it would double this list. This is just the way members of the family have spelled their own name. For that matter, Jonathan, the founder of the family, spelled his own name in different documents. He spelled his own name 4 different ways. There's one document where he spells it 2 different ways in the same document. So, given all these different ones, and you can see even some of them, well, let's forget the capital F and just put 2 Fs instead, or various different ways of getting the fair part and different ways of getting the bank, and sometimes there's an S and sometimes there isn't. And there's one theory that the E sort of evolved into S because people drew them funny. Fairbank versus Fairbanks sounds kind of inconsequential when you see all the different ways they're spelling. And so all it was by the time we got to the point where we have to spell in a standard way, you have to choose the way your name's spelled and that's it. Some Fairbanks happened to be using the S at the time and some didn't, and it doesn't have any particular meaning beyond that. Anything else I want to say about that? No? Okay. So, now on to colonial history. Some more general stuff. One thing I get on almost every tour I give of the Fairbanks house. So again, those of you who have been to the house know the first room you go into, the ceiling in that room is really low. And it's partially because of settling over the years. The house is settled, it's 400 years old. It's going to settle. And that means parts of the ceiling are lower than other parts. And so inevitably, almost every tour I give, somebody walks into the room and says, oh, people must have been really short back then. Every tour. Someone says it. And what I usually say is, no, they were just really good at ducking. The fact is, we'll get back to the other one in a second. The average height doesn't actually change that much over the centuries. In fact, it's got kind of a dip in it, which does line up with the 1600s, 1700s as their low point, where our average height is 5 foot, so this is for men, 5'5" thereabouts. That's the lowest it ever gets. Today it's about 5'8". So we're only looking at a couple inches difference, at most. There are most time periods, though, it's even less than that. So your average heights are pretty similar. So why is this such a common misbelief that everybody was way shorter? There's 2 reasons, 2 things that contribute to this the most. One is those low ceilings. So even the parlor may be exaggerated, but every room in the Fairbanks house, the ceilings are low compared to modern, well, except the East Wing, which is newer. The ceilings are low compared to a modern house. So you go into any old house from the 1600s, it's got these low ceilings. Well, it turns out that they knew, they had limited resources, and they knew how to use what they had. And they knew, even back then, that heat rises. So the less space you give for that heat to rise, the easier it is to heat a room. So if those ceilings are lower, it's easier to heat the room. It also requires, if your room is a foot shorter, it takes a foot less of material the whole way around the room to build it in the first place, right? So it's cheaper to build, easier to heat if your ceilings are low. The other thing that has led to this common misconception is beds from the time period. So if you go into any historic house, Fairbanks House included, you will see the beds look really short compared to a modern bed. Well, that's not because they were shorter, it's because the way they slept. They actually believed, all the way up until, I'd say, the 1800s, that sleeping stretched out, the way most of us do today, was bad for you. So most people slept in the fetal position, and the upper classes who could afford it slept propped up on pillows. So nobody was sleeping stretched out, so your bed doesn't have to be as long. But without knowing these things, you see a short bed and short ceilings, it's pretty easy to come to the conclusion that everybody must have been short, right? So, similar to their height, their lifespan was also considered short. Well, it turns out there are statistics that suggest that, but they're skewed because of, just not properly considering the variable, shall we say. So lifespan statistics are almost always dramatically skewed by two things in particular: military death and child mortality. If you made it past 5, your life expectancy was within 10 years of what it is today. If you made it past 5. But so many people died, so many children, babies, infants died because, you know, they're the most susceptible to disease of any people. So it was just, and they didn't have medicine the way we do now. So the sad fact of the matter was that many children didn't make it to 5 years old back then. And so if you include them in your overall statistics for life expectancy, that's going to skew your average age all the way down to, at some time periods, as low as like 35. Particularly during the 14 and early 1500s, with the 13, 14, early 1500s with the plague, dragged the average lifespan, including children, down to like 35. With children, it stays about 45 years old for most of the 15, 16, 1700s. But if you take out those children, the 5 and under set, your average life expectancy is somewhere around 70, 75 even, in nicer places like Boston.
And that is only speaking to men, to males. Women actually had an even lower life expectancy average because of all the mother mortalities, along with the infant mortalities. So that's why it seems weird today that female lifespan is, I think, the average is 5 years longer than men. The reason why it was then too, it's just there were so many more mother, pregnancy and childbirth deaths.
So a lot of women died in childbirth or because of complications. In fact, Jonathan, the original founder of the family, his mother died of complications from his birth. So it definitely happened, and it definitely, that also pulled down the statistic even more for women. Medical and technological advances and knowing what, germs are, have added about 10 years to our average lifespan, but that's about it. To give you an idea, sort of a dramatic example, Socrates died in 399 BC at the age of 70. And he didn't die of old age. He was actually executed, and he was not considered particularly old. So that's thousands of years ago, and 70 isn't that old. So gives you an idea of how much these statistics can skew and lead to this thought that, well, everybody died young. So let's talk about Puritans, because there's a lot to unpack there. First off, Puritans and Pilgrims, not the same people. In fact, they hated each other, like a lot. The way I think of it is, so both of them are offshoots of the Anglican Church or the Church of England, but they're different offshoots. And the way, if you think about a lot of modern news, particularly in the Middle East and in that part of the world, there is nothing a strict religious sect hates more than a different strict religious sect, right? And that's what the Puritans and Pilgrims were. They were different strict religious sects. They both agreed that the Church of England was not being pure enough. That's where we get the term Puritan. They weren't being, they both thought the Bible should be interpreted literally, and the Church of England was starting to get away from that. But they disagreed on what a literal interpretation meant. Because, it's hard to literally interpret stuff with talking snakes. We also have the, Puritans, Pilgrims, different people, but they're often kind of lumped together. In fact, there's only one instance of any of the original Pilgrims coming to Boston or vice versa. Mary Chilton is the only Pilgrim that moves to Boston, and that's because both of her parents died. And she was just like, I don't really like these people. I'm going to go to Boston. And then she meets up with a guy who ends up becoming governor of Massachusetts. So it works out for her. But anyway, you also hear the Puritans preferred dark, drab colors. They had buckles just everywhere. Mostly hats and shoes, but just everything's got buckles. There's also the myth that they were friendly with Native Americans. And the myth that they were hostile with Native Americans. And then literally everything you've ever heard about Thanksgiving is probably wrong twice. But of course, that's pilgrims. But sort of, but not really. But also, yeah. So yeah, the whole thing with Thanksgiving, there was probably Thanksgiving. Was it anywhere near the third Thursday of November? No. That was Lincoln that put it there, and it was at the request of this lady who thought it was a really good idea to have a national. It was actually, Thanksgiving as we know it was created as a Yay Union down with the Confederacy holiday. So many, many years later. So the Pilgrims did have a big dinner with the local native population, with Massasoit and the Wampanoag. But the way we picture it, it was nothing like that. The turkey wasn't even the main course, it was deer, to give you an idea of just how wrong all that is. But anyway, so yeah, let's talk about what's actually going on. This is actually an image from Plymouth Plantation. Our friends down there have done a lot of work on accurately depicting what, so they may have disagreed on religion, but their fashion sense was pretty similar. Or fashion sense. But anyway, so this is a much more accurate depiction of what Pilgrim or Puritan would look like in the 1600s. First note the entire lack of buckles. No buckles. No. Also that it's not just blacks and browns. She's got a blue dress, sort of a turquoise. He's got the nice red band. They actually, there's some reports that suggest one of the Pilgrims and Puritans' favorite color was what we would call safety cone orange. They love these really bright colors, and yeah. So they love their bright colors. They love their nothing too fancy. Puritans, in particular, had this really interesting sort of back and forth with themselves. They had all these really strict, what we might even call draconian laws, but then they also had all these ways that they developed to go around their own laws. And so you're not supposed to show off. But dye's expensive, so if you use the expensive dye, you're kind of showing off, but not doing it too much. You know, that kind of thing. So there was a lot of that. This is, yeah, so what other questions are we answering? I'm trying to think, what else? Yeah, so no buckles, no drab colors. Yeah, so were they friendly with the natives? Were they hostile with the natives? A little of both, and a little of neither. Particularly here in Dedham, we had kind of a standoffish, but mostly completely neutral interaction. So you guys, if you're from Dedham, you've probably heard of Wigwam Pond, or I've heard some locals call it Wiggum Pond, same thing. So Wiggum or Wigwam Pond is called that because it used to be surrounded by wigwams. That's where the local native, the Massachusetts, guys, the state's named after, hung out when they were in this area. Massachusetts were a traveling tribe. They never stayed in one place for more than a couple of months. But when they were through this area, where they stayed was next to what we call Wigwam Pond. So the settlers, knowing that the natives would use that regularly, just kind of stayed away from that part of town. And there was some trading, there was some interactions, but mostly they didn't really like each other, but not enough to actually like fight until King Philip's War, and that's a whole other thing. But Dedham never actually is directly involved in the fighting, though several Dedhamites do go off to fight in King Philip's War. None of the fighting ever happens here. So the question of are we friendly or hostile with the natives, there is no simple answer that could really be properly made in less than like an hour of talking about it. So this is a very succinct version of it. So anyway, oh yeah, and then we do have Puritans made Christmas illegal. Not really anything to do with the other stuff. I just think it's funny. So yeah, the observation of Christmas having been deemed a sacrilege, the exchange of gifts and greetings, dressing in fine clothing, feasting and similar satanical practices are hereby forbidden, with the offender liable to a fine of 5 shillings. So yeah, there's a 5 shilling penalty for acknowledging Christmas. So yeah, gives you an idea of the kind of people here. But they weren't wearing drab colors. We also, we often hear that, or assume that most people in the 1700s are illiterate, that being able to read, or in the library, is a more recent thing, but particularly here in New England, it wasn't. See, people wanted to read, particularly Puritans, felt that to be a proper member of the church, you had to be able to read the Bible for yourself. So by the 1650s, the average white man, the white men in New England in the 1650s, 60% or more of them can read. By the late 1700s, it's over 90%. And so that's for white men, but actually even for women, even for Native Americans, African Americans, everybody else, that number is not significantly lower. The estimates I've seen are as high as 80% of the total population of Massachusetts. So men, women, servants, slaves, everybody, 80% can read and write by the late 1700s. And that's part of that Puritan mindset, that Puritan ethic. Everybody should be able to read the Bible and encounter God for themselves. That brings us to another thing that people kind of want to believe, so they do, is that there was no slavery in New England. Fact of the matter is, there definitely was slavery in New England. There's even slavery right here in Dedham. So Massachusetts may have been the first state to make slavery illegal in 1783. And that was actually a major trial that involved John Adams and several other prominent revolutionaries. The Massachusetts state constitution, the one the U.S. Constitution is later based on, stated that all men were created free and equal. So an African American slave said, "I am a man, I am created free and equal. It is my right in Massachusetts to be a free person." John Adams defended him in was his attorney for the case, and they won. And he sued for his freedom, and this allowed all African Americans and the few Native Americans that were still slaves at this point to be freed in Massachusetts. But before that, Massachusetts is actually the first colony to make slavery legal in the first place. 1641. They made slavery legal in the colony of Massachusetts. Most of the slaves at that point are not African, though. They are Native Americans captured during various conflicts like King Philip's War. And when I say captured during combat, that doesn't mean they're all adult men fighting. It means if they took a town, the children and the women were also put into slavery. So that is part of Massachusetts' legacy, whether we want it there or not. It is something that happened. And to be frank, there are two branches of the Fairbanks family that owned slaves in the 1600s. One owned African American slaves, or African slaves, and one owned Native slaves. So yeah, slavery was legal in Massachusetts for 142 years. So we might have been the first ones to get rid of it, but we had had a long history of it before that. And we were also involved in the triangle trade directly, very directly. So if you're familiar with the triangle trade, Africans are sent to the West Indies to become slaves. The main thing they're harvesting in the West Indies is sugarcane. That sugarcane comes to Boston, where it's made into rum. Boston was actually the top producer of rum right up until the early, actually 1900s. It's the top producer of rum in the United States. And that's where we get the molasses flood, but that's an entirely different thing. But anyway, so the sugar cane comes up to Boston, made into rum. That rum is then shipped to Africa, where it is traded for more slaves, who are shipped to the West Indies to make more sugar cane and so on. So, on a lighter note, the Salem witch trials. So slightly lighter, I guess, only slightly. Now this is, so these last two are actually examples of knowing a little bit can be more dangerous than not knowing anything. These are both things that you will have probably heard from an academic or historian or a tour guide that are just completely wrong. So there's actually an academic paper published by a pathology student, not by a historian, but a pathology student, suggested that maybe the reason the Salem witch trials happened was that the whole town of Salem was suffering from ergot poisoning. So what is ergot? Well, it is a weird fungus that grows on rye. And so up here in the northern colonies, wheat doesn't grow very well. A lot of people are eating rye bread for one of their main sources of fiber and all that. And ergot poisoning does happen. But there is actually, while this person postulated that it was possible that the mass hysteria, which led up to the Salem witch trials could have been caused by ergot. But today, most historians have a consensus about this. No. No. It doesn't line up quite right. Ergot poisoning would have actually sent them even further over the deep end than they went. And it's pretty clear today that while wherever the Salem witch trials started, they ended up as land grabs. People figured out that if your neighbor gets accused of witchcraft, guess who gets your neighbor's land? You do. So people started accusing their neighbors of witchcraft, knowing that if they got hanged, all their land suddenly belongs to you. So why not accuse that neighbor you don't really like anyway, if you can get all his stuff for it? So ergot poisoning did happen, and it would usually, first off, it was often lethal, but second off, it would hit a town far harder than anything that ever happened anything involving wheat that happened in Salem. No, Salem witch trials happened entirely because of humanity's ability to do awful things to other humans. It didn't need hallucinogenic poisons to happen. The other bit of knowledge you've probably heard from a historic house, but that is completely wrong, is the expression sleep tight. This often gets referred to as being from the ropes used to hold up a rope bed needed to be tightened periodically. So, okay, if we, we need to tighten a bed, so sleep tight must mean, sleep on a bed that is tight, is comfortable. But as one thing I was reading pointed out, sleep tight would be like telling the bed to sleep well, right? The person isn't tight, the bed is. So yeah, there's a problem with that. It gets worse because the timing doesn't even work out. First recorded use of the expression is from 1866. And by that point, we're already starting to phase out rope beds. They're moving on to more modern beds. And it doesn't become popular, it's just sparsely used here and there until the early 1900s. That's when it becomes popular. And if you look at the vernacular from that point, in that time period, tight is a popular expression meaning good or well, right? So it kind of come back around. So I think it was a big deal in the 80s and early 90s, right? That's tight. Yeah. Same thing, same expression. Was there in the early 1900s, and that's all it means. Sleep well. It has nothing to do with rope beds. And actually, it doesn't really pick up until the Beatles used the term in one of their songs. Then everybody uses it, but it's not really popular until the Beatles. So yeah, nothing to do with rope beds, because I'm pretty sure the Beatles are well after rope beds. Does anybody have any questions? Yeah.
I do. So you were talking about the Underground Railroad, and
yeah.
So the myth that I had heard around Dedham was that the white chimneys always indicated that that house was a house that would accept, people and let them hide in their house.
Well,
I think it's a white chimney with the black.
Yeah, I think I know what you're talking about. One thing to remember is that there's a difference between abolitionist and on the Underground Railroad. And a lot of people do conflate those. If they're an abolitionist, they must have been part of the Underground Railroad. Massachusetts is a very strong abolitionist because of the whole thing with John Adams and everything. This is where that kind of idea started, so it is where most of the abolitionists are. And so there's a lot of people who are very supportive of the ideas. And I've heard something, maybe not the chimneys, but I've heard stuff about marking like, this house is, African American, free black friendly, There would be a way to say that, the way we might put out a flag today to say this, this location's trans friendly or all Black Lives Matter or whatever, anything like that. It was kind of there were equivalents in that time period saying like, I believe in abolitionism, you mark your house that way. But, so I guess.
Like putting up a pride flag today.
Like putting up a pride flag, yeah. So I guess if a runaway slave made it up here, they would be able to know which houses where people are actively supportive of their cause. But I don't think the direct connection is not there.
So you haven't ever heard anything about the white chimneys being...
Well, I feel like I've heard things about that, but yeah, my general understanding of that there is a relation to that kind of thing with anti-slavery movement, but it's not a direct you know, if you're a runaway slave, you can go here. It's not that direct.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions or anything? This one came out a little shorter than some of my talks, but so.
Well, are there any other questions about Puritans versus Pilgrims or early New England history?
Or does anybody have any myths or legends that you've heard and you're like, or you've heard some factoid and you're like, I don't know if that's true. Maybe I know if it's true or not.
So I have a question.
Yeah, sure.
So the colors of the clothing, would that have been, you had said something about dye, but did they make their colors from the natural resources?
Yes, they did, yeah.
So if they had red berries, I don't know if they had cranberries back then, maybe they did. Would they
This
have
is where they
used-
discovered them, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, red dye is a little more red is the complicated one. Red is actually the hard, well, purple is the hardest dye to make. And it's so hard to make, it involves live squid. So it was so hard to make that it became the color of royalty, because they were literally the only ones who could afford it. Red, that was the next most expensive color. And that comes from, it's very hard to make a red dye that stays red. So most things that we know of that are red fade fairly quickly. And also, part of the problem is actually biology. The cones in your eyes have the most trouble picking up the color red. So to make something red, it has to be really red for humans to see it as such. So if you make something a little red, other animals might be able to see it, but humans are like, that's kind of dull. So you got to add a lot of red to something to make it actually look like red does. So yeah, you need more, and it needs to be more steadfast than most red things were. So red dye was really hard to make. So if you have red clothing, that was a sign of wealth. Or something the Fairbanks did is in the parlor, the nice room where they entertain, the walls had red highlights on them. Which by our definition would be really gaudy. The room was actually whitewashed and had red ovals painted all over the walls, doors, and even the ceiling. So it was white with red polka dots. And that was considered the height of fashion, but it was a way of subtly showing off your wealth, because those red highlights meant you had money. But again, Puritans were not supposed to blatantly show this stuff off, but if you have subtle decorative accents like red dots, that sort of shows wealth without being too ostentatious, which we can never do if we're Puritans. Yeah.
Getting back to the Fairbanks.
Yeah.
What is the last year or so that it was inhabited?
We know that exactly. Rebecca, the last person to live in the house, moves out in 1904. And she was the 8th generation of Fairbanks that lived there. She was in her mid-80s when the rest of the family convinced her it was time to move out. Because by that point, in 1904, there's no heat, electricity, or running water. So she's in her mid-80s, it's kind of rough. So they are concerned for her welfare, but also by that point, they really wanted to make it a museum, and it's hard to do that with an 80-year-old lady living in it. So they convinced her to move out in 1904. But she moved in with some friends here in Dedham and lived for another 4 years. She died in 1908.
If by convinced you mean started legal proceedings because Rebecca refused to leave,
Yeah.
but you know.
So, yeah. Convinced in a very strong fashion, yes. Yeah, another question.
Also, I heard that, didn't she also get hit by lightning?
That is part of the family legend, and I think if it's true, it's actually the reason she moved out had nothing to do with the family threatening lead-up proceeding. It wasn't her that got struck by lightning, it was her dog. So the family story goes that she's laying in bed one night and her dog is under the bed. Lightning strikes the house, goes through the floor, hits the dog, killing the dog, but she up on the bed was unharmed. But actually, it is legitimately hard to find a photograph of Rebecca without the dog next to her. So I think she was closer with that dog than she was with any humans. And when the dog died, that's when she decided I don't want to live here anymore. It's time to move out. It had nothing to do with the family trying to push her out. She's just like, I don't want to live where my dog died. So she left. Sadly, we don't know what the dog's name was. I would love to find that out. Because I'm sure, she had some very affectionate name for this dog that, like I said, literally hard to find a picture of her without the dog. So we don't know if that's family legend or not,
Yeah,
but that's the story.
That wasn't in this talk because we don't know the truth.
Yeah, we don't know whether it's myth or not, so I can't definitively include it. Yeah.
Didn't they have family reunions up until the time?
We still have them today, second Saturday of August every year.
that?
The first one was actually in 1902, so it was 2 years before Rebecca moved out of the house, which I'm sure she was thrilled with. She actually said, I'm paraphrasing, but said something to the effect of, well, they all say that they're my cousins, but I don't recognize any of them. I could give a whole talk just about how delightful Rebecca is. In fact, I might, maybe in the fall. I'll give a talk just about Rebecca, because she's amazing. Actually, the three sisters that preceded her, those three sisters, they're pretty incredible too. They're delightful, eccentric ladies. So, yeah.
About 15, maybe, could have been 20 years ago, but at least 15 years ago, I saw a program on PBS about the ergot.
Ergot.
Poisoning. And, you know, anything you see on PBS, you figure is definitely true.
Yeah.
So since then, and I have heard since I saw this program that that's not true at all.
Yeah.
But it was very convincing at the time when I watched the program.
That's the problem. So again, the ergot poisoning thing started with an undergrad science paper, was where it first came up, and then a academic, a historian, read this and was like, "What if this is true?" And then somebody said, "Oh, it's true." You know, it's telephone. What if this is true? What, is it true? Yes, it's true. Okay, this is true. Everybody believes it. So it telephoned, and it just got way out of hand off of this one undergrad paper, and so like it does sound feasible on the surface, but if you really dig it, so it got feasible enough that PBS picked up on it. But yeah, if you actually really look into ergot poisoning, it does not line up right with what happened in Salem. It did happen. There were towns that were wiped out by it, but not Salem. So, but yeah, it got enough traction that it ended up in PBS and major books. Like high-end academic, well-respected authors were talking about ergot poisoning for a while, and then somebody actually went and like did the like in-depth research necessary and said, "There's nothing here."
It's kind of one of those things like, you know, every week it's like red wine's good for you now. No, wait, red wine's bad for you. No, it's good for you again. It's always legitimate health services with doing these studies, but, you know, they keep coming out with new information.
Yeah.
But what are the symptoms of ergot poisoning?
So it's pretty awful. It causes, it starts with like twitches and ticks and sort of movement issues, and goes into like full blown. You just some people actually go psychotic, which is where this whole like idea maybe witches. People go completely crazy and will start like murdering each other under really bad ergot poisoning. But most people, it just starts messing with their nervous system until it shuts down and they die. So ergot poisoning is awful. The Salem witch trials are awful, but they don't need each other to be awful. They're both awful on their own.
Where does something like that happen today? The ergot poisoning?
It's very rare today because it is actually really, you can see it with the naked eye. It's this black stuff growing off your eye. So today we know, oh, that rye's black, I better not eat it. So it's very rare today. It was pretty much in places with in times with limited resources and limited understanding of fungus that they're like, huh, the rye looks funny today.
Well, and also if you're baking in a brick oven and you've got the ashes and everything, you know, there's something black in your bread. Oh, it's probably some soot from the oven. You know, it's not necessarily as clear as today when it's like, oh, there's something wrong.
There's
with
also the fact that there may have been trace amounts that weren't visible back then, and rye was actually cooked specifically to be eaten like a week later. Rye straight out of the oven is inedible. It's supposed to soften for a week before you eat it. So that's a week for the fungus to start growing. So there may have been also times where, it was untraceable amounts, not these black chunks coming off the rye. More intraceable stuff that grew after cooking. Because that's the problem with fungi is that the whole heated enough doesn't always work like it does with bacteria. But yeah, the whole ergot thing's really complicated and really weird and kind of disgusting. Then again, most of history is when you get down to it.
I think that's what Mad as a Hatter.
Yeah.
With the Alice in Wonderland, that was supposed to be ergot.
The version I've heard was that it's actually mercury poisoning from curing the felt for the hats required mercury, and they were often applying it with their bare hands. So mercury is bad for you not just when you ingest it, you can absorb it through the skin.
There were
So-
several professions worked with mercury, but Mad
Patterns
Hatter
were the most-
Mad Hatter took off. I think just because Mad as a mirror maker doesn't roll off the tongue as easily.
Yeah, and then even if it had like less traction, then Lewis Carroll uses it. No, this is a good thought. You want another question?
How structurally sound is the house now? I know that
Very.
a couple of cars have gone through it.
Well, just one. That's enough. First off, we got lucky. It missed all of the main. It missed any main supports when it went through. It just hit a non-load-bearing wall, thankfully. But also, it is incredibly well built. There's actually, I think was my last talk the 400-year-old? Yeah, so actually if you go on our YouTube channel, my last talk was about how they built the house and how it's still standing. But the short version is, it was built really well, it was well taken care of, and third and most importantly, the main reason it's still standing, blind luck. You don't get a wooden house lasting 400 years without a little luck involved. So like that car may have gone through the east wing, but it managed to miss everything structural in doing so. So that kind of luck is definitely an aspect. Speaking of.
Is it the oldest in the U.S.?
It is the oldest in North America, oldest wooden structure standing in North America. Yeah. So things were built before it, but they're not up anymore. So it's the oldest thing still standing.
Oldest wood thing.
Oldest wood thing still standing in North America.
There's older, adobe stuff and stone stuff in the Southwest and in Florida.
Yeah. So there's the Pueblo Indians built the cliff face. Those are thousands of years old. Palace of the Governors was built in 1610 in New Mexico, but that's made out of stone and brick. And then there's one Spanish mission in Florida that's older than us too. But those things aside, and all of those are made out of stone or clay, we're as old as it gets at the Fairbanks House. Any other? Yeah.
As soon as I moved to Dedham, I was told there was a murder. Is that a misconception?
No, that's not. Unfortunately, that is not a myth. That is Jason Fairbanks.
And that will be the talk in September.
Yeah, that's the September talk. But the short version is Jason Fairbanks was tried, convicted, and hanged for the murder of his girlfriend. Still some questions over whether he did it or whether he was mentally fit to stand trial. But he was convicted and hanged for it regardless. So yeah, whole talk about that coming up in a few months. Yeah, September. So, so let's talk actually about July. Because July 4th, I wanted to acknowledge that the Fairbanks are a very patriotic family. So we're talking about Fairbanks who serve their country. But we're not doing it on July 4th because, as I said, no matter how exciting I am, I'm not as exciting as fireworks and burgers. So we're not going to do it on the 4th, we're going to do it on the 11th, so the second Thursday of July. It'll be right here, 7 o'clock. On July 11th. I hope you can all make it to that. So that's July. What was August?
That's not confirmed. At
You
this
were not
time.
sure what August is yet, but September, because it's part of an anniversary, is when we're going to talk about Jason.
But we'll announce what August's topic is soon on, keep an eye on the Facebook
Once we figure
page.
out what we're talking about. Yeah.
Did one of the Fairbanks also get convicted of hanged for stealing a horse, or?
No, I think that's mixing a couple of Dedham legends together. So you have Jason, who is convicted and hanged for murder, and then you have the Society in Dedham for the Apprehension of Horse Thieves, which I just joined, by the way. Actually, she bought me a membership for my birthday. Because it's still around. In their entire career, they helped catch 2 horses. And by help being a very generous term. But anyway, and now, there's the Horse Thieves Tavern named after them. So there is this society in Dedham for the apprehension of horse thieves, and they did help catch a couple of horse thieves, but no, as far as I know, nobody was ever executed for horse thievery. I don't think it would have gotten that bad. Execution would be a bit much for horse thievery. As bad as stealing a horse was, I think... I'm trying to think what the penalty would be. Probably time in jail and a really high fine, like multiple pounds. Multiple shillings. Anyway. So I think that's one of those two stories got put together. That happens a lot, actually, in history. So, any other questions? Yeah.
I've heard that there's ghosts.
So, I assume that's a plug for the ghost tours that start mid-August. Anyway, yeah, so there is a lot of paranormal activity that happens in the Fairbanks house, and we do have a tour we give specially about that every Friday and Saturday, starting mid-August through the end of October. Yeah, there is weird stuff in the house that I can't explain, so if anybody's interested in that, those tours do book up fast. We'll probably start booking in July. Yeah, of course.
Yeah, in Ipswich, there's a house, I think it's called the Howland House, Holland or something like that.
Sounds familiar, yeah.
I'm pretty sure it's the one in Ipswich where they had a big fight with Dedham. They were the oldest.
Oh,
house.
Beverly.
Yeah, actually, the one that we really had, the Bulge House in Beverly, yeah.
Okay.
There were a few houses that were close, but the big fight was us and the one in Beverly.
Okay.
Bulge House. Both said we were 1636. And there's a big fight, who was actually built first? And so we did what's called dendrochronology, tree ring dating, and found out the Fairbanks house was built in 1637. So we were close, but we were that year off. So the Bulge House is like, this is our chance, we'll prove that we're actually older. They did dendrochronology and found the oldest wood they could find in that house was 1675. So we were off by a year, they were off by almost 50.
So part of the problem, a lot of historic houses, and this was part of the problem with the Fairbanks house, why they had the wrong date also, is that we couldn't find historically when the land was deeded, or when people started living there, but unless you do dendrochronology, you can't find when the actual building was built. So the land was deeded to the Balches in Beverly in 1636. This land was deeded to Jonathan Fairbanks in 1636. That's not necessarily when the houses were built.
Yeah.
And you find this problem at a lot of places.
Yeah.
For instance, what is it, the Dean Winthrop house?
Yeah.
They market themselves as the oldest continuously lived in house, which is probably true because people do actually still live there. But a lot of their paperwork says they were built in 1637, which should make them as old as us. The house was from the 1670s, but the land was from the 1637.
There was a house there in 1637, but it's not the house that's there now. And well, that's the thing. One thing that makes this confusing is, so today you do any building, you got to get cleared with the town and all this. Even if back then, if it's your property, you do what you want. You own the property. You don't have to tell anybody you're building a new house or a new barn or tearing down your house and building a new one. So there aren't records of the houses. It's just records of the land. So that makes these things a lot more complicated. So. You and then you.
Thought about changing the date on the chimney?
Yeah, yes, but it's more complicated than it looks. Because it's over that sloping part of the roof, you would need to set up full scaffolding just to get to the chimney. Yeah, so it's, we have thought about it, but it's been, so far it has proven to be non-cost effective. I think what's going to happen is, if at some point we need to do a repair that puts us up there anyway, that's when we're going to change it, but until then it's going to say 1636. But it's just not.
Many of the family members also didn't want it changed just because it's the image that's been around for so long. That, I mean, it was only painted there like 40 or 50 years ago, but it's the image is on postcards and on people's pictures,
so
and they have a connection to that, even that number, even if it's not right.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, so there's been thought about it, but yeah, so far it's been cost prohibitive, but we have considered it. Yeah.
What is the size of the property?
It depends on the time period. Today it's 4 acres, just shy of 4 acres. Jonathan was originally granted 12 acres. At its height it was about 185. That's around 1800. And today it's 4.
The lowest it ever got actually was 2.
Yeah. Yeah, when Rebecca inherited from her 3 sisters, it was 2 acres. The first curator, so my predecessor by 100 years, so the first curator was a guy named Henry Irving Fairbanks, who was a great combination when you're founding a museum. He was delightfully eccentric and independently wealthy. Best combination you can have when you're starting a museum. He decided 2 acres wasn't enough, bought the property next door, bringing us to the 4 acres we are today. But he's also the one who built, if you've been by the Fairbanks house, the other building on the property, that was Henry Irving's idea as well. It's actually a 1912 Sears and Roebuck kit house. So, yeah. So that would be pretty historic on its own, but it kind of pales in comparison to the 400-year-old house next to it.
So when it was 120 acres, where did that land go?
Well, first, it wasn't contiguous. The property around the house itself probably maxed out at about 50 acres. Then the rest of the property was spread out throughout Dedham. So what you got to know is back then there was no way to convert land to do what you wanted it to. So you needed to have the land where it already did the thing you were looking for. So you want to grow flax, you need low meadowland. You want to grow apples, high hilly areas are better. You want to grow other things, you need flat areas. So you would buy the land where it already did the thing you needed. So people's property would be spread out all over Dedham, and Dedham was huge back then.
But they didn't go up to Wiggum Pond.
No, generally the area just around Wiggum, they kind of, Wigwam or Wiggum Pond, they kind of kept for the natives at least until probably the mid-1700s. At that point, they started pushing the native populations west and disrespecting them in general a lot more. And anyway, any other questions? Yeah.
Are you still finding artifacts? Do you do a dig?
If we were to dig, we would probably find more artifacts, but we haven't actually done an official one in quite a while. Actually, what I want to do at this point, and this would require a large grant, which we haven't gotten yet, which is why we haven't done it. At this point, the best thing we could do is a more scientific dig, rather than just picking a spot and hoping there's something down there. Get what's called ground-penetrating radar, and which costs a lot to rent. You need to rent a person who knows how to use it in addition to the thing. So you bring that in and you scan your whole property with it, and actually the ideal thing to find would actually be the outhouse, as disgusting as that sounds. Because back then they didn't just, go. That's also where they threw all their trash. And you can learn a lot about people from what they throw away. So that would be probably the next dig we would try to do, but that would require significant funding before we could.
Don't they move that around?
Well, yeah, there were probably several, over the 267 years people lived there, there's probably a dozen of them. But yeah, if we could find any one of them, that would probably give us some kind of information.
Well, and as icky as it is, you actually can also find out a lot, not just from the stuff they threw away there, but from actually the use of the outhouse, because what they ate would end up absorbing into the ground, and so you can find a lot about the mineral contents of the, the iron levels and etc. Were they suffering from lead poisoning or whatever?
This is why I want to hire professionals to do this rather than trying to do it myself, because apparently on a really warm day you can still tell what it was. Did you have?
I was wondering when the privy was put in.
The sort of indoor plumbing was added so the room that it is in was added about 1800. It was converted to a privy probably in the mid 1800s, 1850, 60, somewhere in there.
So that's when they abandoned the outhouse.
Well, no, they would still have the outhouse.
Okay.
The privy is for sort of emergencies. It's the middle of the night. It's middle of January. It's raining.
Okay.
Then you use the privy, but there's no hole in it. There's just a bucket.
Oh, right.
Excuse me. So which you'd have to empty into the outhouse on a regular basis.
And that's what she used in 1904?
4. Yeah, it's the three sisters put it in, and then Rebecca's using that right up until she moves out. Yeah.
When the three sisters put it in, it was a cheese closet, though.
Yeah, it had been a cheese closet. They converted it to a privy. So insert
it
joke
wasn't
about
both
cutting
the same
cheese
time. Don't
here.
worry.
Anyway, on that note, I think, unless anybody has any other pressing questions. Oh, yeah.
Well, just an FYI, so as you guys can see, both Dan and my emails are up there, so please feel free to reach out to us with any questions. I specifically am running different summer programs. We're going to be having some classes over the summer on marbleizing paper, which is how they made book covers and wallpaper in the Victorian era. So if you have any interest in signing up for a class or you want more information about it, feel free to email me. We also have created a YouTube channel where we are posting these talks and other things that we're doing. So go to YouTube, check those out, subscribe. It's the Fairbanks House Museum. There is a page that's the Fairbanks House that's not current. You need to click on the one that has the word museum in it. So the Fairbanks House Museum. And this talk will be up within a couple days, and future talks will be up also. But we still encourage you, obviously, to come and participate in person, because then you can ask questions and all that.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you all for coming. Hope you enjoyed.